Hi, this is Paul, and I'm going to do something a little bit different in this video. A lot of my monologue videos are just me kind of working things through. Well, maybe this isn't so different. This is more specifically about the Christian Reformed Church. I am a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, and I will be the ministerial delegate to our annual synod, even though our synod, which is the meeting of representatives from the United States and Canada, each Classis, which is a regional assembly. There are three assemblies in the Christian Reformed Church: the local church council, the Classis, which every church sends 3 delegates to Classis, to each Classis meeting. Usually happens twice a year. Then once a year there's a synod meeting, and every Classis sends 4 delegates: a ministerial delegate, an elder delegate, a deacon delegate, and then one that can be of any of the offices. And then I am the ministerial delegate to the Christian Reformed Synod this year. And as I've spoken about in previous podcasts and videos, the big topic in the CRC this year is the Human Sexuality Report. And I've gone through the history of that in previous videos. Now, there are currently 2 advocacy groups, let's call them, in the Christian Reformed Church. One is advocating for LGBTQ inclusion, same-sex marriage, these types of issues. That group is called All One Body, and they have a website, allonebody.org. And they've been around for a number of years. I've treated a couple of their videos. They have their own YouTube channel. But a new group has arisen from the well, I'll call them the traditional perspective, and they are the Abide Project. And in the same way, they have articles, they have videos. One video that just caught my attention. Let's see if comes up right away. One video that caught my attention is by a former pastor of mine, Reverend Dave Beelan. Dave Beelan was my pastor in college and seminary. He was a mentor to me, and he's retired now, but he was in the Classis that is at the center of a lot of the controversy, Classis Grand Rapids East, and he speaks from a traditional position. He is on the board of Preston Sprinkles organization. I had lunch with Preston, or breakfast with Preston, after Preston did a presentation here in Sacramento a few weeks ago. So I might be treating this video a little bit. I don't know. But Dave is someone I respect and trust a lot. And I'll put the link to his video in here, and you'll very much get a sense of the at least one of my pastoral mentors. Of course, I speak about my father. He, of course, was another one of my pastoral mentors. But when I think about who a pastor is and what a pastor is, Dave Beelan was very much someone who formed and shaped me. And he is, in fact, older than I am, even if he looks younger. So that's my friend Dave Beelan. Now, this website has a variety of projects, papers, things of that nature that they are dealing with. And another friend of mine, David Snapper, who is a friend of mine via CRC Voices that I've mentioned on previous podcasts. And this one was quite early. This one was April 2018. And I didn't even make a thumbnail for the video back in those days, but I had a conversation with David on forgiveness. Now, David Snapper has the distinction of being a CRC minister that likes to play with numbers and statistics. Before he was a Christian Reformed minister, I believe he used to teach high school science, and so he has a thing about numbers. And so one of the things that David has been doing, both when he was active in ministry and now in his retirement, he's been keeping close tabs on numbers in the Christian Reformed Church. And he wrote a paper for the Abide website. I don't know if they're going to post it or not. I hope they do. I think it's a good paper. It's a bit of a depressing paper for the Christian Reformed Church, but I think you're better off facing the facts rather than hiding under a stone. And so I asked David if I could do some reading from his paper for my channel, and he gave me permission. And so I'm going to take some time and take a look at his paper and the Christian Reformed Church and its future. If you're not interested in that, well, now's a good time probably to click away. If you're curious, stay with me. So I'll start reading the introduction. This document has one purpose, the paper says, to map out an action plan for managing the impending conflict in the Christian Reformed Church in North America as it processes the Human Sexuality Report. I'll put a link to the Human Sexuality Report in the notes. It's a PDF file. It's nearly 200 pages, but it will give you an idea of the traditionalist position in the Christian Reformed Church as comes out of the 1973 study committee. Now, I had a couple of conversations with Clay Leibolt. Clay Leibolt is on the progressive side of this issue. I had a roundtable with 3 other CRC ministers about this issue. In anticipation of Synod coming up in June, I may well have more conversations about this. If I intend to do that, I should probably get busy and line up some things because I know some people do want to talk about it. I've asked for, I've invited some of the individuals who wrote the synodical report to come to the channel because I've been trying to give airtime or at least YouTube channel time to both sides because sort of like Dave Beelan, I think it's important that we talk about this. And I might, like I said, I might play some clips from Dave in this conversation. But this video, I want to take a look at David Snapper's paper. The CRCNA, the Christian Reformed Church of North America, is entering what can be described as the perfect storm, the convergence of several negative factors. One of the negative factors is capable of causing significant damage to the Christian Reformed Church as measured by membership decline and other metrics. The 4 converging factors of interest to this report are demographic decline, the end of the baby boom, unresolved conflict, the ongoing effects of the women in office debates, the conflict surrounding impending human sexuality report, and finally the complex and unstable intranational and binational relationships in Canada. All 4 factors will be discussed. The 3rd factor, the human sexuality report, will have the larger focus. Defining the dilemma. The Christian Reformed Church model for conflict resolution is based on research, reflection, and respectful deliberation, and ultimately a group, synod, decision which is considered to be settled and binding decision. This could be called the church order model. The current perfect storm, and particularly the conflict over human sexuality report, will not be resolved by following the conventional church order model. And I agree with Dave Snapper. He and I have chatted on this on the CRC Voices discussion group for a number of years. Why not? Why can't the church order model resolve this conflict? Because both sides of the debate have declared uncompromising positions which are incapable of resolution in a conventional debate. I would add to that there are presuppositional positions held by both sides that will make it nearly impossible to come to agreement on this. Rather than resolve the conflict, the church order model will protract the conflict, increase losses of all types, and result in a defeated and discouraged remnant or remnants. Since the progressive position is currently excluded by the church order, the progressives can only win in the sense that any change is a win. Conservatives, in contrast, have everything at the start of this debate, and therefore have everything to lose, in a sense that any change is a loss. Experiences from other denominations, from our close ally, the Reformed Church of America, which is right now in the process of splitting up and trying to figure out what's left of their denomination, and from our own history demonstrate that the church order model will result in a long, grinding loss for the conservatives. Now, I would nuance that because I don't think that the bulk of the Christian Reformed Church is probably going to change its stance on this. There was a survey done, and 15% of Christian Reformed clergy are affirming. I expect that number to go down, partly because of the ways that denominations grow, and specifically the part of what we saw in the Reformed Church of America. The progressives advocated both for LGBTQ inclusion and also increased focus on recruiting ethnic minority congregations. Now, what's been interesting about, and similar things have happened in the CRC, what's interesting about that process is that one works against the other. Most of the ethnic minority congregations that come into the Christian Reformed Church tend to be more evangelical and also more conservative, often more biblicistic than the Christian Reformed Church has traditionally been. The exact same thing happened in the RCA, and in fact, part of what provoked the current dissolution of the RCA was that a coalition of non-majority culture clergy went to the denomination, basically said, either you resolve this long-standing issue or we're gone. And so then you're stuck having to choose between which would you want to be an all-white do you want to be an all-white denomination, or do you want to be an affirming denomination? And the rest is history when it came to the Reformed Church of America. The conservatives at this moment in time have a few months before Synod 2022 to make strategic decisions which will set the course for the future. These are the basic options. Follow the church order model for 5 years of conflict. 2. Attempt an all-out and immediate definitive victory at Synod 2022. 3. A third approach outlined in this paper. The report is divided into 3 sections. Background, and goes in background, the human sexuality report, and strategies. 3 strategies. The thesis of the paper is the conventional approach, call it the church order model, is based on a sequence of debates in which conflicted parties present their positions, deliberate, and then decide on a course of action. While it is necessary to follow the model because it is required by our shared church order, it should be understood that this model is not capable of constraining the progressive side of the debate. In short, this model has already failed multiple times, and there is no reason to believe this conflict will have a different outcome. Churches wishing to maintain an orthodox historical theology of human sexuality will be best served by a secondary and complementary approach, not a substitute, outlined in this document. And so he'll go into that. I doubt I'll get quite that far because that's not actually the focus of the paper for me. I do hope that Abide will pick up this paper and post it, and if not them, if they decide to beg off on it, then I'll talk to David Snapper and I'll probably post a PDF so that you can read it if you like. The portion of the paper I really want to give some attention to is, in fact, the demographics portion of the paper, because this, in fact, impacts many more denominations, not just the Christian Reformed Church. And I think it is part of the story of institutional church decline, and is, in fact, a big part of the story of, as I've been talking about, established Protestant church decline. Now, David has an eye issue that he's awaiting surgery for, so there are a number of typos in this paper, which I have not sought to correct, but David is aware that there must be because he's had some trouble with his eyes for a few years now. The birth rate in the Christian Reformed Church and the family size has dropped sharply since the turn of the 20th century, and notably since the late 1970s. We will see that in 1993, the drop became precipitous. Currently, the baptism rate is insufficient to maintain the membership. In other words, the Christian Reformed Church, which has never been a tremendously successful evangelistic denomination and has mostly survived by having a birth rate which would replace the membership or grow the membership, is now in a position where there simply is not enough. There are not enough young families to sustain the denomination. That is completely apart from the conflicts of women in office that resulted in approximately 60,000 members leaving the denomination, and the impending conflict over same-sex marriage The state of our demographics is so significantly negative that at the current rate of membership decline, over 3% per annum, we are losing about 7,000 members per year. Of that number, about 1,500 are baptized members. CRCNA has dropped in membership from 316,000 to 211,000 in about 28 years. It goes without explanation that this is a non-recoverable situation. Now, I think, in fact, these numbers are conservative and that the decline is likely far worse because, generally speaking, the conservative congregations tend to have more families, more young children, more intact families, most often in rural or agricultural areas. That certainly is the case in my own Classis in Central California. It's also the case now that during COVID, I think, as with many churches, we will see between a 10 and 25 or even 30% loss of members in the denomination, and we will in fact see a number of churches that were just on the bubble in terms of viability not make it. Factor 2. While conflict is normal and can be productive, unresolved conflict normally is destructive. Since the 1970s, the Christian Reformed Church has experienced approximately 50 years of intermittent conflict related to human sexuality, along with the role of women leaders in the church and others. Sometimes the conflict simmers in the background. Sometimes the conflict boils over. Even more important than the experience of conflict has been the failure to resolve the conflict amicably. Strikingly, I cannot find instances where denominational leaders have made even the smallest public attempt to reconcile factions within the Christian Reformed Church of North America. Now, part of this has to do with the church order model of church communion. Denominational leaders usually, on one hand, are often called mostly to pay attention to shared ministry structures. In the Christian Reformed Church, I call that the PSI board, synodical boards, which for the most part oversee certain ministries that are done on behalf of the denomination. The Christian Reformed Church doesn't really have standing leadership as such. The Christian Reformed Church is led by its three assemblies, which is the local church council, which is in some ways the most abiding and standing of the assemblies, a regional Classis, which technically only is instantiated when Classis meets. At the end of every Classis, that classical deliberative body is dissolved, and 6 months or so later, a new one will be constituted. Most Classis have some structure called something like a classical interim committee that are supposed to sort of manage business between meetings of Classis, but they always do so sort of deferring to the deliberative assemblies when they meet. Similarly, Synod has the same structure. Each synod, in a sense, stands on its own. Now, there is a council of delegates that meets, but most of what the council of delegates does is oversee the PSI board, the synodical boards of the denomination. And in that way, our denomination doesn't really have a leadership structure or leadership offices. Now, some of you who have different types of ecclesiastical structures that have bishops, or even if you're Roman Catholic, a pope or a patriarch or a metropolitan, structures like that have leaders who are overseeing the ecclesiastical body, the organic body of the church. In the Christian Reformed Church, we have assemblies that are supposed to do that, and that's in some ways part of the issue. Now, I'm not advocating that the Christian Reformed Church adopt a model with a hierarchy with individuals who are in charge of the distributed church, but this is part of the question about leadership in the Christian Reformed Church. I think this contributes to the dynamic that Dave Snapper is pointing to of unresolved conflict, that it's in fact very difficult to address conflict if no one is responsible for the church as such, and therefore to address the conflict. Dave, in fact, spearheaded a synodical overture which was passed, which was supposed to address unresolved conflict, even though it was passed, I think partly because of the way the Christian Reformed Church structures itself, nothing was really ever done about it, and that's talked about a bit in this report. Strikingly, I cannot find a single instance where the denominational leadership has made even the smallest public effort to reconcile factions within the Christian Reformed Church of North America. Now, part of what you'd have to do in that case is to, in fact, recognize factions. All One Body or the Abide Project don't have any ecclesiastical standing. Should they? Probably not. So again, part of what we're dealing with here are the change in, it's an overall part of the technological disruption of the church. Even 50 years ago, well, there were certain magazines that were critical within the Christian Reformed Church. There was Christian Renewal. There was Outlook, which was sort of an alternative to the Banner in the Christian Reformed Church. And so newspapers and magazines tried to do this, but the speed by which now via blogs, websites, videos, the Christian Reformed Church structure just is not really set up to imagine this type of powers, these types of spirits, these types of advocacy committees for the church to sort of figure out what to do with. Unresolved conflict, once launched, brings its poisonous cargo to each new port. Unresolved conflict waits and broods like an antlion setting a trap for the next triggering event. The Belhar Confession was such an event. When it crossed the desk of synodical members, it erupted immediately into a full-blown conflict because the emotions of the previous unresolved conflict were already present. That is, the women in office debate was simmering unresolved, and that debate continues to simmer unresolved. This unresolved conflict has surfaced in the unexpected firing or resignation of at least 7 executive directors in the CRC in Canada. Now again, these executive directors are not actually directors of the ecclesiastical body that is the organism of the church. They are directors of these, on behalf of ministries, what I call the Psi Board, that sort of operates much more in kind of a business atmosphere. You have a human resources department, you have directors, you have employees. That's all in many ways alongside the church, which is organized by its 3 assemblies. The human sexuality port, when it reaches Synod, will be another such trigger. Do we wish to resolve this conflict? Surprisingly, maybe not. In Synod 2018, an overture was presented. This is the overture he had a hand in. Overture 18, which encouraged the church to seek reconciliation among its various factions. While the overture was adopted by Synod with virtually no debate, the Council of Delegates failed to act on that overture. Then, upon a reminder, the Planning Board explicitly declined to include reconciliation in its agenda for 2021. I think part of the reason, and this is where David and I might have a disagreement, part of the reason reconciliation is not pursued is because many of the people believe it's not possible. That the decisions made by the individuals and the positions taken are at a level deeper that can be addressed by these deliberative assemblies. Now, I'm also a synodical deputy, and so recently I visited a Classis that had a difficult decision to make. And as a synodical deputy, I was there to advise, to make sure that proper procedure was followed. but also to participate to a degree, not to decide for the classis, but in fact to help the classis deliberate, to raise the issues that the classis itself had to decide. And I thought that was really a fine example of a productive deliberative assembly. But the matter upon which the assembly had to address what was a conflict, at least in that was in a couple of the churches in the classis, wasn't of the nature of these positional debates. These positional debates, I think, are very much set up pre-rationally. In other words, people don't just wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to believe this or I'm going to believe that. In fact, if someone says they believe these things by decision, culturally, we believe that these decisions are somehow inauthentic, that these decisions should be made in a much more intuitive way, but sort of along the lines of what I often call, with respect to the secret sacred self, we consult the secret sacred self, or perhaps we consult the Bible, or perhaps we consult the Holy Spirit, or perhaps we consult books that are on the shelf of individuals or groups of people that we trust, or perhaps we consult personal experience, and then we decide what is right and what is wrong. As I was talking to one colleague once about this issue, he made the complaint to me, which I fully understood, that one might imagine that if someone has a question, they could approach their pastor and discuss this. But in the majority of cases, many people have already made up their minds, and they come to the deliberative assembly not so much to deliberate, but in fact to promote their particular position. And that is, of course, true of both sides. And ideally, in a deliberative assembly, both sides are articulating positions, but there is at least enough freedom within the assembly to make a decision. Now, all of us who are familiar with the democratic process have an understanding about how this works, because we see this playing out in our political sphere. And if you've been following a bunch of my recent videos, a lot of this, in fact, does come out of Protestantism, broadly speaking. Factor 3, the Human Sexuality Report. It goes without saying that the Human Sexuality Report is one more example of a huge culture change in North America. Many other denominations have experienced the liberalization of policies surrounding same-sex relationships. The Human Sexuality Report is only one example of a conservative counter-argument in a sea of culture change. The Human Sexuality Report has generated about 70 overtures to Synod 2021 and more for Synod 2022. The All One Body website has taken a strident stance against the Human Sexuality Report. The Abide website, among others, has taken a church order model approach by sharing information and making its biblical case. This third factor, as demonstrated in many other denominations, has the potential to divide the Christian Reformed Church into at least two separate fragments. And he goes on a little bit to the structural conflict with respect to Canada. Let's address some of the demographics. Here in front of you is a chart of Christian Reformed Church membership, which is taken from the Christian Reformed yearbook. The yearbook asks congregations to send in their numbers. And so this is the only indication we have of this. It's by no means a perfect indication, but it gives us some information. Basically, the Christian Reformed Church continued to grow until 1992. The precipitous decline between 1992 and 2000 had a lot to do with the exodus of churches over the conflict about whether or not women could be leaders in the Christian Reformed Church. There was a little recovery then in the early aughts, but since then the numbers have been in decline, and a rather steep decline. The Christian Reformed Church dropped in membership from 316,000 in 1993 to 211,000 in 2021. Of the current members, 65,000 reside in Canada. The balance, 145,000, reside in the USA. The year 1993 is well known to be the year in which Synod began the final decisions towards not resolving the women in office debate. What he means by that is, instead of deciding that this is the stance or that is the stance, the Christian Reformed Church basically said either option is okay, and both options will be respected. Now, saying that both options are respected in theory does not necessarily mean that every single person will respect both options. It also doesn't mean that the advocacy groups that started, and again, this was before the internet age, the advocacy groups that started would stop politicking, either formally or, in fact, informally, among people who would make these decisions. In fact, the local option was embraced, which meant that in some ways the battle was moved from the binational assembly, which is synod, out to every single congregation and every single classis. What that meant was the conflict and the arguments would be rehearsed in every place. Votes would be counted as to whether an individual church would allow women deacons, women elders, or women clergy. And then classis would have to decide whether women would be seated at that classis. And then when a majority of classes allowed women to be seated, then women were allowed to be seated at synod. I was a delegate to that synod in 2004. And there were tensions. There continue to be tensions over this issue. Many women clergy or elder or deacon delegates to classes or synods sometimes say they feel like second-class citizens because there are individuals in churches at those classes or synods that don't believe that they should be seated. Similarly, generally speaking, because a majority of the denomination is in favor of this, many complementarians who don't believe women should be seated at classis or at synod and don't believe that women should be ordained as clergy also feel like second-class citizens. Unfortunately, after the Christian Reformed Church made the decision to no longer discuss this issue at synod, not only did the conflict sort of move to the local and regional level, but the church in some ways stopped talking about it. In the run-up to the decision, there was a lot of talk of those who were advocating the local option to, let's try it out and let the Spirit decide. But if we were going to pause and ask ourselves, well, is the Spirit in favor of this or not? How will we know? How will we come to this determination? We haven't talked about this at all. And it's been, going on 30 years we just recently had 25 years of it becoming official, but 30 years and more of the conflict. But to raise this issue again is nearly impossible, as David Snapper notes in the church order model. He's got various graphs which don't necessarily, I'm gonna switch the way I'm viewing. This graph, the children baptized by year 1963 to 2021, demonstrates the long decline of annual baptism. Because the data begins in 1963, the tail end of the baby boom, the reader may think that 1963 is a normal year. What's clear from this graph is that the larger cultural decline of births and the lower fertility rates affected the Christian Reformed Church of North America. The baby bump centered around 1984 seems to be the excess of children. Are there excess children, David? The large number of children born to the baby boomers. With a little imagination, it seems that 30 years later, there's a small echo of the original baby boom. The non-professing members is in gray, and baptisms is in orange. What is the normal rate? We do not know. What we do know is that the decline of baptized children in the church from 132,000 to 57,000 leads to unsustainability. Closer look at the critical years. Includes are showing a closer detail of the critical years 1980 to 2000. Non-professing members. Non-professing members are baptized members which have not yet made an adult declaration or profession of faith. Most non-professing members are children. Some are older. Now, what's critical about this is that, in fact, in many churches, there are non-professing members who are on the books, but if they are older than 18 or 21, it may very well be that they are just simply on the books, never taken off the books, and churches at some point worry about what to do with them. In many cases, these are people who have simply walked away from the faith or walked away from the church. In the Christian Reformed Church, once you are sort of on the membership rolls, you are not taken off unless you're transferred out, you die or you are disciplined. And because, for the most part, there's no church discipline in the Christian Reformed Church, formal church discipline, apart from clergy and employees, that means that there are probably a good number of non-baptized members that are in fact not attending a Christian Reformed church and may not even be attending any church, quite possibly so. The next graph, non-professing members, selected the center slice of the earlier graph. The identical data is packaged differently to highlight the critical period of conflict around 1990. The visual difference between the graphs demonstrates why sometimes data is not trusted. You see that baptisms just drop. The baptized membership just drops. In non-professing, 1980 to 2000, the actual baptized membership and the rate of new baptisms was relatively stable or flat from 1980 to 1990. In 1991, both sides of the graph became a sharp decline. Here we see how steep the rate of decline becomes in a short period of time. Full disclosure, in a private conversation with a Calvin sociologist, when Steve Timmermans was executive director of the denomination, he started, actually Jerry Dykstra started this tradition of sort of a state of the church address at Synod. Steve Timmermans, whose background was, he was a psychologist, he has a PhD in psychology, so he was a social scientist. He would look at some of these numbers and he would often look for bright spots, because overall, many people looking at these numbers would say, this is troubling. And to go back to our earlier question, where does the Christian Reformed Church find leadership? Basically, no one is in charge of this, and beyond the assemblies, and for the most part, assemblies don't quite know what to do with all of this data. In the private conversation with the Calvin sociologist, I held that the decline was largely associated with conflict and membership transfers out. He held that the graph only appears to take an unexpected downturn and that the explanation lies in the ongoing decreased fertility rate. The reader is invited to spend time with these two charts, for they represent important information related to one of the most critical movements in Christian Reformed history. I would basically say that it's both. No matter who is correct about cause and effect, the graph is striking and clear. The Christian Reformed Church is baptizing fewer babies and therefore has fewer in membership. For the record, our rate of evangelism and transfers are below the corresponding rates of reversion and transfers out. The decline in baptized members is about 25,000, from 117,000 to 92,000. This is a dramatically large number. The Christian Reformed Church currently reports 67,000 families and 58,000 baptized members, or about 0.87 children per family. Divided up into 20 years, the 58,000 baptized members results in almost 3,000 children graduating from high school each year, for example. That number is not large enough to fill our universities and colleges, for another point of reference. One of the things that the Christian Reformed Church was focused on, especially during its growth years, was to build Christian day schools and Christian colleges for its youth. Over the last 30 years, most of those institutions basically have learned to survive by attracting other, usually evangelical Christians from the surrounding world. When I went to Calvin College, probably 80 to 90% of the student body were from the Christian Reformed Church. Today, the number is less than half, and that number is going down. I just heard a report at our recent Classis meeting from our board delegate from the Calvin Seminary Board that, in fact, as is true of all colleges, college enrollment is down, period, and that is affecting Calvin College, and I assume Dordt and some of the other colleges as well, just in terms of the demographics. But you see here, what this has meant is that what had been institutions that primarily served the Christian Reformed Church, they now serve the general evangelical public. Now, what that probably means is that, again, my larger argument that overall, what the Christian Reformed Church is really dealing with is assimilation into the broader elements of American life. And that is the main line. I've been talking about establishment Protestants and the evangelical world. A majority of the Christian Reformed Church would much more easily align with the evangelicals than the main line. And in fact, the institutional movement of embracing evangelical children who are motivated by parents who are looking for a conservative evangelical atmosphere for their children, an alternative to public school, means that most of the pressures on the Christian Reformed Church are in fact going to lead it to become more conservative as time goes forward, not more progressive. Professing members' losses during the critical years of 1990 to 2000. Two additional graphs will demonstrate the significant changes that took place in the early 1990s. We will see that during the critical moment, the loss of families, members, and baptized members created a hole in the membership which appeared 20 years later when the children were no longer members and therefore did not baptize children. It's not that these people went out of existence, of course. They just weren't in the Christian Reformed Church, and many of them weren't in church at all. I maintain that the right angle decline of the early 1990s of professing members shown so striking in this graph has best explanation in the fact that the Christian Reformed Church was, in fact, losing members at the measured and graphed rate. And the correspondence between the conflicted years of synod and the decline in membership is as much causal or coincidental. That is, the chart is depicting the actual dramatic decline, transfers out of professing members. This claim is consistent with the drop in overall membership and with the drop in baptized membership. The drop in professing members during the period is about 20,000. The increase in the previous decade was about 25,000 professing members. I claim it is not realistic to attribute the dramatic change from growth to decline to the unresolved conflict of the decade. The reader is cautioned. The total membership decline was 45,000 in that period. The decline of children was 25,000. The decline of professing members was 20,000, rounded. The math is consistent. 20,000 plus 25,000 equals 45,000. Similar to the previous graph, the Christian Reformed Church has tracked members, non-members, and families for quite a number of years. It used to count families because families were sort of giving units, and denominational assessments to local congregations for ministry support was based on numbers of families traditionally. Similarly, the previous graph, I know Julian said he likes wonky church insider stuff. Well, Julian, this video is for you. Similar to the previous graph, families, total 1980 to 2000, demonstrated exactly what should be expected based on the decline of professing members. Families declined from 7,000 in 1991 to 71,000 in 2000, the decline of 6,000 families. As noted earlier, the total decline for the decade was 45,000, matched to the 6,000 families. That's 7 persons for lost family. Probably no one would claim that 6,000 families of 7 members all left the Christian Reformed Church. There must be another explanation. I believe the answer, and this is critical, is that when entire congregations were leaving the Christian Reformed Church, there was no one left to report. No one was left to turn off the lights, so to speak, in terms of reporting numbers to Synod. We know they are gone because of the decline in total membership, which appears so consistently in the yearbook. We can safely assume that many members slipped out without leaving a transfer out notice with the church council, since there were no more church council to receive this note. It may be impossible and unnecessary to recreate the precise membership losses during that time. The current reader should recognize the losses probably were unrecorded by clerks. The net decline was about 45,000, and that year, 1991, was the turning point. It was the same year I was ordained. I guess I brought the trouble. Let's talk about distribution, because this is actually pretty important. And David had written a paper that demonstrated that for Christian Reformed church plants to really flourish, generally speaking, they should be planted in areas of significant Christian Reformed populations. When the Christian Reformed Church would plant churches in places where there weren't significant populations, the vast majority of those churches never got above 200 members within 2 years of starting. And for people who track membership of new churches, if you don't break 200 in your first 2 years, generally speaking, you never will. And churches that are less than 200 people often don't survive more than 10 to 20 years. The 211,000 last reported members of the Christian Reformed Church live in Canada and the USA. Approximately 60,000 members reside in Canada. Approximately 150,000 members reside in the USA. In Canada, the 60,000 are not evenly distributed. Most live in Ontario in several clusters or communities. Outside of Ontario, clusters are found thriving in the plains of Manitoba, on the east slopes of the Rockies. Farther west, clusters of congregations found in British Columbia. Of the 125,000 CRC members in the USA, approximately half live in Michigan, in the small area bounded by Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Muskegon, and Holland. This area is approximately 2,000 square miles. This leads to a calculated population density of 60 CRC members per square mile. That's very high. An interesting coincidence is that the total CRC Canada population approximates the population of the CRC in West Michigan. In contrast, for the sake of comparison, the remaining 60,000 CRC members in the U.S. live in the remaining 3.8 million square miles of the United States, or 0.015 persons per square mile. In other words, if you're a member of the Christian Reformed Church and you live in Western Michigan, on average, you share your square mile with 60 other CRC church members. If you live someplace else, it's going to be a long ways before you see another one. Now, of course, that's not actually true because these are churches, but it gives a sense of density. Alexa calculated differently in density to be a stunning 4,000 times denser than Western Michigan. The reader may benefit from similar calculations for 1,000 square miles surrounding, and of course, CRCs are actually clumped in certain areas that sort of follow Dutch immigrant patterns in the late 19th century and after the Second World War. So you have clumps or clusters or colonies in Sioux Center, Iowa, Pella, Iowa, Ripon, California, northern New Jersey, and a few other places. However, as in Canada, CRC members in the USA are not evenly distributed. Most CRC people live in clusters of congregations. Earlier research has demonstrated that the cluster of should be 2,000, I think, rather than 20,000, or more CRC persons are home to the most stable congregations, the fastest growing church plants, and the greatest numbers of resources. In other words, what David discovered in his previous research is that when CRC members clump together and they build their institutions, those churches have a far better chance of not only retaining their own membership, but actually growing through evangelism and outreach to other people in the community. In other words, Christian Reformed culture and polity is a known thing and an attractive thing. But where, like in a place like Sacramento, where the Christian Reformed Church is sort of out there on its own, it's a bit tougher. Now, one of the things that we tried in Sacramento was simulating a cluster. We planted a bunch of churches, and we've continued to work closely together as churches. But while Kevin Adams, who I plan to have on the channel because he wrote a book recently, and Kevin and I go back for when I first came to Sacramento, he was an abnormally successful church planter up in Granite Springs and Rockland. Most of the rest of our church plants have stayed under 200 and have struggled as small churches, just trying to make their way forward in the world. Isolated congregations, not located within the bounds of a group of 2,000 CRC people, are the least stable and rarely are able to plant a church that reaches 200 members. Isolated congregations rarely have a surplus of resources and generally need support. It should be anticipated that the membership damage done to local congregations in a sustained human sexuality report conflict will be in inverse proportion to the membership size of the congregation's cluster. Generally, the larger the cluster, the less the overall damage done to the average congregation. Therefore, the most isolated congregations are the most likely to experience the greatest challenges, have the least restorative resources, and the least margin for loss. A preliminary estimate is that 200 congregations fall into the category of small size, isolated geography, and increased vulnerability. Note that this is a sweeping generalization and should be understood as a concept, not a prognosis. Along the same lines of reasoning, isolated urban ministries, historical rural congregations of 100 souls, new church plants, specialty ministries, these are likely to be the most vulnerable. For example, of 8 congregations organized in 1970 and still reported in 1995, 4 were located inside large clusters. 4 were isolated. It is my understanding that all 4 isolated congregations have ceased ministry and disbanded. The 4 inside larger clusters all reached over 500 members. In other words, he picked 4 churches, 4 from each type of churches, one within a deep cluster or colony, and the other without. And within the span of 25 years, the 4 within a cluster or colony grew to over 500 members, and the 4 isolated ceased functioning after 25 years. After over 40 years of research, I have seen this all too frequently. What once was called home missions new church development, church plants were located in isolation apart from supposed negative influence of the cluster. There was a time in new church development where they sort of wanted to replicate the kinds of success that they saw in the seeker movement in new suburban contexts where there weren't any other Christian Reformed churches. For the most part, those experiments all failed. There are few that succeeded, but those are the exception to the rule. The table below outlines the harsh realities that isolated congregations, measured by local CRC population with less than 500 people, are all isolated by definition, and every one of them failed to survive. In contrast, those in larger clusters all did survive. The smallest of them retained 568 members in the year 1995. Now, I would also add something to Snapper's thesis that what's been happening in world-class cities, northern New Jersey, where I grew up, the San Francisco Bay Area, that is part of my Classis now, Southern California, where I often have to travel as a synodical deputy, Though that would be in and of itself a very interesting study, because some of those clusters, in fact, did get fairly large, but because of the dynamics of population migration, skyrocketing property values, many of those CRC clusters in world-class cities have declined significantly. Northern New Jersey, where I grew up, when I grew up in Northern New Jersey, there was a vibrant, long-standing Christian Reformed church community that today is just a shadow of what it was when I grew up there. Interpreting the data. This data is important for many reasons, and it deserves to be correctly understood. For the purposes of this report, this information reveals a great deal about the existential risk to the Christian Reformed Church. Risk is defined to be a factor which has potential to cause a significant membership decline or otherwise disrupt the ministry of the denomination. Our primary focus in this report is the risk to the denomination, a legal entity which gives corporate identity to thousands of congregations, to 1,000 congregations. What threat could damage the Christian Reformed Church? What is the possibility that a threat could do damage? As we see from our peer denomination, the Reformed Church of America, the threat of an organized disruption is real. What threats pose a real risk to the Christian Reformed Church? The answer is all four factors described above have the potential, individually and collectively, to cause significant administrative or operational damage to the church. Our secondary focus in this report is the risk to the local congregation. Although it is reasonable to assume that risks to the congregations and to the denominations are closely associated, and this is a valid assumption, the nature of the risks are different for each. Now we turn to the focus on congregation-specific risks. Congregations are at risk. The Christian Reformed Church in the USA, distribution is a distributional chart made in 1995. It shows the number of congregations in each of the family member size. For example, in 1995, the CRC in the USA reported 85 congregations at 30 to 40 family unit marks. That would be 120 to 160 members, nominal. 25 years later, our congregations are averaging 30% fewer members. Of the congregations currently in the CRC USA, the same shape for distribution is still found, but now all of the congregations are much smaller. Some congregations will shrink in size due to what might be called fatigue ablation. People grow weary of the hassle and the conflict. They walk away. Congregations lose members one or two at a time. Some congregations will continue to operate, but will be so small they will have little meaningful role in their community. Some congregations will disband, of course. Now, what he has here is membership size. And what has happened is that the Christian Reformed Church, which has never had mega churches, or very few of them, mostly had medium-sized congregations. Increasingly, especially outside of those cluster areas, more and more of those congregations are small. You can see that in Northern California. Right now, with the exception of the Golden Gate Church, which is a Chinese congregation, and some Korean churches, almost all of the significant sized churches in the Christian Reformed Church in Northern California are in the Central Valley. Churches that had significant size in the San Francisco Bay Area now are small, many of them sort of teetering on viability. We have every reason to believe that at least 200 congregations are near or below 100 members, and that a disruption to membership caused by conflict could catalyze the loss of 20% of congregational membership. Such losses can cripple or destroy an otherwise viable ministry. The loss of congregations caused by conflict is a significant risk factor to congregations, and therefore the entire CRCNA. Now, I'm going to leave that here, and actually I think I'm going to play some of the conversation with Dave Beelan because... So I started going to Madison Square in Grand Rapids in the early 80s. I started going to Calvin College in 1981. And I believe I started going to Madison Square when I was a junior. And my sister came to Grand Rapids to go to RBC, and she found Madison Square, which at that point was significantly bigger than the congregation we grew up with in Patterson. And my sister said to me, "Oh, I found this church that's kind of like Northside, congregation we grew up in." Percentage-wise, it wasn't as African-American as our church at home, but she wanted me to come, and one of my roommates, actually named Calvin Friend, also wanted to come, and so the three of us started going there. I didn't have a car, but my roommate Calvin did, and so we started attending Madison Square weekly. And Dave Beelan had started pastoring there in 1982, as he mentions in the video, and I had some. The Christian Reformed Church is a fairly small place, so there were some people that knew my father, and that became a very important part of my formation in my college and seminary years. And Dave really was quite a vital mentor. While of course my father was, of course, a very big mentor of mine, he was in many ways much more of an informal mentor, and Dave was much more of a formal mentor. And Dave, through his years, mentored many other CRC pastors. Now, the Madison Square Christian Reformed Church actually grew to be quite large, planted a number of other churches in Grand Rapids, and is really a very important congregation in the Christian Reformed Church.
In 1982, I was ordained as a pastor pastored at Madison. And within a few years, we had an elder who identified himself as a celibate homosexual. And then there were two elders after that were in mixed orientation marriages. In other words, the men were attracted to other men sexually, but they had decided the way to follow Jesus is to be married to a woman, and they both had children as well. So in the late 80s, early 90s, I had three different elders who were same-sex attracted and would talk to me about what that life was like and how to follow Jesus.
Now, it's helpful to think about the fact that Madison Square was sort of an alternative church in the Christian Reformed Church. They had a significant emphasis on racial reconciliation. They had significant outreach to the African-American population in Grand Rapids. They had two pastors, one Dante Venegas, who had been in New York, Spanish Danny. There's a wonderful biography of him that's available. And Dave Beelan and Dante Venegas were co-pastors, and they were both my pastors. And the church also had a significant number of individuals that were part of sort of a charismatic Christian commune in Grand Rapids. And that commune had some bumps in the road, and a number of people left it, but the elements of sort of third wave Pentecostalism, spiritual giftedness, that was also a piece of the church. And so Madison Square had a lot of very interesting elements to it at that time. And Dave and Dante were very much our pastors. And, it was really the place grew, and church growth in Grand Rapids is a little weird because there's such a huge Christian Reformed population that if a church gets popular for one reason or another, it can really grow fast. But there are a number of elements in the church that made the church, especially the leadership, I'd say, made the church a rather popular place for people who were looking for an alternative than, let's say, what many more traditional Christian Reformed churches would have offered.
Then I started reading a little bit. It was about, I've got some notes here just to go over this. I started preaching sermons on sexuality. So I do a series on sexuality. And already in the early 90s, I had one sermon that was dedicated to how do we deal with homosexuality and people that are same-sex attracted who are among us. And it felt very, I hesitate to use the word, but it felt progressive. In other words, it was ahead of its time. I didn't find other people that were touching that subject, but it really came out of my conversation I had with my friend in college. Then Classis Grand Rapids East formed a committee, and they actually, the committee's
This is quite a few years later. He's compressing a lot of time. What he's describing now happened significantly after I was there. I think he's talking about things in the 20 teens now.
mandate was to, let me read it here a minute, examine and summarize scholarship that supports same-sex marriage. And when the mandate itself was proposed, I objected to it on the floor of Classis because we need to critique it, not just examine it and summarize it. Then they formed the committee. There were about 8 or 9 people on it, and twice they asked me, we have no, what they called conservative voices on the committee. We want you to be on it. And I looked at the mandate and I said, I really can't serve on this committee considering the mandate. Then they came back a second time. The chair of the committee and the clerk of Grand Rapids East appealed to me again and said, we'd like you to be on the committee. So then I prayed about it some more, ran it past some people around me, discernment group. They encouraged me to be on it and to give some balance to it and just to see what I could learn. In 2015, that report was getting ready to get published, and I had to either sign it. Well, sign it's not quite the right word. Your names are just listed at the end. Here's on the committee. And then I insisted that I have a note that I am glad that we're working on this issue, but I disagree with the conclusions of this report. So that was kind of a footnote at the end. And then I decided, instead of trying to write a minority report, which I didn't think people in my congregation would even read, I wrote a 13-page letter to my congregation, which I'm happy to talk about at some point if Dave or others want to ask about it. In 2016, Preston Sprinkle, I don't know if you know him, but he's a leader in this area in the evangelical world. He got his PhD in New Testament theology, and he formed a board, and I was on that board then, and I still am. And I think he's a great resource for our work. In 2016, I also held a class at Madison to talk about this stuff because I thought as a pastor I need to do that. I had, at last count, and that was 2 years ago, I had read 39 books in the area of same-sex attraction and the Christian approach to it. And I'd be happy, for example, I read Bronson's book and then reviewed it for our elders and gave them a copy of it. I helped run a conference at Calvin in 2018, Calvin University. And then just recently, and I'll close with this, I feel like I've been going on too long anyway, but a person who identified themselves as transgender, started coming to our church, and she was transgendering from female to male. Jesus stopped her. That's the way she talks about it. And she stopped the counseling that she was doing and the hormone therapy she was doing. And she was just baptized this last Sunday at Madison. And Matt and Lori Krieg, who are also members at Madison, they're in a mixed orientation marriage. And they are strong believers and part of our church. I just say that to encourage all of us. And I want to stop there because that's a long summary.
No, I don't mind that. I think we
Okay.
could all listen for a lot longer.
Dave doesn't understand that. This isn't television. There's lots of time, Dave.
Let me poke at a couple of things.
Okay.
So first of all, it's really encouraging to hear that over the years you've had a lot of positive experiences with people who are dealing with their sexual or gender identity, because frankly, a lot of those stories get buried. Perhaps part of that is because a lot of those folks who have had good experiences, not all of them have the fiber to want to be a mascot paraded in front and made a topic of conversation. And then you could also argue that some of it is because frankly, churches don't always handle it very well, tragically enough. So it's good to hear some of those positive stories. I'd be curious to hear more of that at some point. But you mentioned a letter that you wrote, and you said that you didn't want to just write a minority report because you're like, I don't think my people would read this. And that, again, is what I come back to is I love that you have a pastoral heart working in parallel with your head. It's not good enough to just know things and have the right answer. I want to lead people. That's great. So when you wrote that letter, that 13-page letter, some of us have read that, but what did you say in that letter, if you had to put it briefly, and then how was it received?
Yeah. So first of all, strategy-wise, I decided not to try to make this a statement from our church. I also didn't want the elders to be surprised by it or to know how to, I don't know what's the word, defend, talk about it when people ask them. So I first submitted it to them and I said, I am not asking you to agree with every line in this letter because I think it'll take too long for us to get there. This is not a committee project. This is me as a pastor speaking to our congregation based on the kind of things I'm hearing. So what I don't want you to do is treat it like a report or a statement of the church, but that you are encouraging me as a pastor to write this letter to the congregation as a pastoral letter from their pastor, which the elders have reviewed. So strategically, I tried to put it in a place where it wouldn't get bogged down, because frankly, there were elders who were affirming on that elder group, which I also didn't know until I wrote the letter. I would say the letter in some ways surprised people. We're known as a church of inclusion. I don't usually use that word these days because it carries freight that I don't like. And we've got our own words in the scriptures. So I just talk about the beloved community or the church. But we're known as a church of inclusion, and especially along the issue of race. And we were early adopters of women in positions of leadership in our church. So I think it was surprising for some folks. In fact, a section of my letter was, how is this different than the women in office approach? Or people would say, hey, from our church would say, we were wrong about whether women could serve. People from Madison would say this, are we wrong about this as well? Are we just going to change our mind? So I had to address that issue. But I actually started with a prayer of confession, because a shorthand way of doing this is to say, our posture has been like this or like this. We need our posture to be like this to same-sex attracted people. And our position needs to remain because it's biblical. So let's shift our posture and solidify our position. Just giving people words in a shorthand way to address this. So I tried to do that in the paper and then start with our church, the church, not Madison in particular, but the Church of Jesus Christ has treated people who are attracted to the same sex in ways that have hurt them deeply, and we just need to start with there. Let's get the speck of the log out of our own eye first. So then after that prayer of confession, I talked about the big picture of marriage and the purpose of sex. What is it? And then, does Jesus speak to same-sex marriage? And is this like women in office? And then advice to the church, and then advice to same-sex attracted people. And then I closed with a letter to a made-up person, so to speak. I named her Alicia. So started with confession and ended with a pastoral letter to someone who was sort of a composite person of people that I had pastored over the years.
So how was that received when you publicized that letter? You said already that you were surprised that a couple of your elders were not where you thought that they were.
Yeah.
Were there any other surprises in terms of how that was received?
I think it got widely distributed. I didn't realize, I started getting emails from people that I didn't know, or
I got a copy of it.
I hadn't seen in 10 years or 20 years, saying, can I have a copy of your letter? Part of what we did is we didn't make it on purpose available on our website. People had to come to me to get it. So I was a little surprised about how fast it moved into other churches and other connections that we had. there were a lot of people at Madison who said, "Thank you for doing this." I think there was a lot of people who said that. However, there was a pretty strong vocal minority that pushed back. So I knew.
Now, part of the reason I'm talking about this section of the video here is that part of what Snapper is saying is that in large congregations, let's Madison Square, I don't know where they're at right now, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400 people perhaps. Let's say they lose 100 or 200 people. They can do that. I know congregations that are 40 to 60 to 80 or 100, and especially if they're in sort of a blue state area or a blue state city, they could lose a half of their congregation, and they don't have a half to lose. And so part of Snapper's thesis is this issue is going to, like with many issues, pastors have sort of, well, we're not going to address it directly. There's the position of the Christian Reformed Church. We're going to leave it at that. And we're going to deal with individuals one at a time in a pastoral manner. And that usually involves a great deal of patience, and working with people where they're at and letting people, figure out their relationship with the church and the relationship with the community as they struggle with the issues.
This was going to be difficult. So I knew this was going to be difficult. I didn't realize I was going to lose so many friendships over this. That surprised me.
Wow. So how over what period of time did all of that hit? I mean, was that like one really bad week, one really bad month, or one really bad year?
No, it actually, the initial response is the people that were saying, "Thank you, Pastor, for putting this letter together. I agree with you." Right away, they started talking to me about it. And some of them would engage in conversations. Some of the parents who had same-sex attracted kids used it as an opportunity to say, "Oh, we think we can talk to our pastor." The tone of this letter and the way I talked about it in the congregation to them said, "Hey, we can go talk to Pastor Dave about this." Some same-sex attracted people that I didn't know were in the congregation, they came and talked to me. Some of them disagreed. It was after about 6 months or to a year, especially when it became clearer and clearer that Madison Church was not going to change its position, but would align with the denominational's stated position on the website. Some people tried to change us. When that didn't work, they left. And that's actually, some of them just left. See, that would be 2016, 2022. That's 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So some people hang tough for quite a while. But I would say we lost people over this, and I think it hasn't finished. There's still more. There's still more sorting out going on.
And again, part of Snapper's thesis is a church like Madison Square, although it's painful, that sorting out probably won't threaten the institution, the viability of that local congregation. I know other congregations that it will end them. And what that does overall is going to be a pretty big sifting. And
yeah, so let me pick up on that. One of the things, at Abide, we're convinced that the CRC really needs to take a solid position on this. This is not an issue that we can have it both ways on and stay together, and nor has it been for any other denomination.
Now, part of the reason he's saying we can't have it both ways is because at this point, the advocacy group in favor of inclusion is asking for a local option that would basically mirror the Women in Church office strategy. Part of Snapper's thesis here is that, in fact, that strategy did not resolve the conflict over women in office in the church. It just displaced it.
You mentioned that to me earlier when we were talking before this. And so a lot of what we're appealing to There are pastors that are worried about dividing their denomination and who will pay a great personal cost. Some of our churches are more united on this than others. I will speak personally and say that were our denomination to come down on a hard Orthodox position, I don't think there'd be very many people in my congregation to fight me. A lot of people who fight that have already left, and a lot of people have been won over who were on the opposite side by God's grace. But there's other people where they may, when this hits one way or the other, there are pastors who are already tired from COVID, who are going to find themselves in a position where they have these emotional appeals from people saying, my friend or my son or my so-and-so is, how could you say this? Or how could you divide us over this? And so a lot of the pain that you felt, I feel like we're going to face down. Some of us will. And so here's my question for you. What advice would you give pastoral? I mean, you had to write this letter and have this conversation in a healthy way in your church, and it still was painful. What advice would you give to pastors who are trying to figure out how they're going to navigate that come what may after June in Synod?
Part of the reason I wrote the letter in 2015 is I could see what's coming now. Of course, I didn't know the details or the timing of it, but I felt like if I didn't do this now, and get the tone right, not just the content right, but the tone right. And for example, it would open the door for me a month or 2 or 3 or 6 months later to actually pray a prayer that would include people who are same-sex attracted in our congregation. Because I wouldn't have to pray that prayer and then have people wonder, well, where's he at on this? Is he starting to slip and slide? Because they already have the letter and it's well known in the congregation. So it was actually a little late. I mean, I thank God for my friend at Calvin who came out that night, because I don't think I would have been preaching about same-sex attraction already in the 90s.
Now,
if I hadn't had that gift. I didn't ask for that. God just gave it to me, and I would see it through his eyes. Now, he actually tried to do a mixed orientation marriage and had 2 children. He was at my wedding. I wasn't at his wedding because I was on an internship, but we remained friends, but eventually his marriage came apart. So I don't want to make it sound like the people that I've known have all been able to manage this costly discipleship pathway that they've chosen easily. It's not been easy at all. Just a little more to try to be specific with your question, Dave. The reason I'm on Preston Sprinkle's board is because he does the very things that you're asking about. If you go to that website, the Center for Gender, Faith, and Sexuality, he's got pastoral papers in there, and he's very pastoral himself. And I would say read things that help you get prepared for the very kind of emotional questions that people have, and listen to them well. Listen to them before you start. I mean, it's basic pastoral wisdom is make sure you listen to people and don't speak out of your fear, but out of your love for the people that God has called you to shepherd. And I would also say, I wrote a note to myself to make sure I said this today. I had to be more concerned what Jesus thinks of me than what people think of me. I mean, that's not just true about this conversation, it's about everything. So I imagine myself in front of Jesus and him saying to me, you made it, I forgave your sins, welcome home. You said some things you shouldn't have said, or you had a chance to say some things and you didn't. I mean, it's not as if I'm going to go to purgatory because I don't think it's there, but I really want to have in front of my imagination all the time, whereas maybe part of my crap detector is, how does my Lord feel about what I'm saying as a pastor? I need to be more concerned on the fear of the Lord needs to be stronger than the fear of people. And then read Sprinkle's stuff. Preston Sprinkle, the Center for Gender, Faith, and Sexuality, has some new videos out. I mean, they've been doing stuff for young people, so I would order that. It's a $200 investment, but there's 12 sessions there. They're very well put together. It's high quality stuff from Jackie Hill Perry, if you might know her name, for example, is one of the presenters, and it's really geared for young people. Another thing I would say is you probably won't be able to win those people who are already soft affirming and they become hard affirming in the just the cultural flow of today's world. But you have a responsibility, in my view, as elders, pastors, leaders in the church, to catechize the youth, because they are getting catechized by the culture around them, and they need a strong, firm, winsome, compassionate, pastoral catechism on many things, but particularly human sexuality.
Yeah.
All right, so link to this whole video if you want to listen to. I haven't listened to the whole thing yet, but yeah. So again, this to sort of part of the reason I deal not just with the few videos that I've done in this channel on this topic, but with everything here, is that I think this issue, along with many others, have far deeper roots in the culture that are far broader than just questions about human sexuality. So I am, in some ways, I am more skeptical of a specific catechesis without a broader addressing sense-making in the culture with respect to whole ranges of issues, which is why my channel is the shape it is. So, yeah, I am out of time right now, but I wanted to introduce at least some of David's paper. I won't put a link to it below. It is not yet on the Abide website. I am hoping that they do publish it, and if they in fact decide not to publish it, then I will probably come back and do a short video just having the link to it, so that if you're curious, and this I know will mostly pertain to members of the Christian Reformed Church, if you are curious about it, you'll have a chance to read David's paper. And not only will you be aware of All One Body, which I've linked to and commented on in previous videos, I have a significant video that's 3+ hours of some of my open wonderings about this issue that you can certainly find on my website. Maybe I'll link that one. You can find here on the channel. I'll link that one below. And yeah, I don't expect this to be my most popular video on my channel, but in anticipation of Synod 2020, given the challenges that the Christian Reformed Church is currently facing, this is something I wanted to do. So my apologies to my regular listeners that don't care a whole lot about the Christian Reformed Church, and I hope those of you who are part of the Christian Reformed Church will take some time, check out All One Body, check out Abide, talk to your pastor, and pray for the denomination. I think generally speaking, I don't know how much longer the Christian Reformed Church will last, but while I am pessimistic about the particular wineskin that is the Christian Reformed Church in North America, I am optimistic for the church and the kingdom of God. And those of you who follow my channel generally know that I think there will be massive changes, relocations, dislocations, transformations of the church in the next 25 and 50 years. I think it's very difficult to anticipate the shape of such things. But God has stewarded his church before through significant transitions, and I think we are probably continuing to be in a transition likely as significant as the Protestant Reformation, whether that means an end to the protest and a reunification of God's churches, or what exactly that means, I do not know, but I trust God and I trust his Spirit, and may his kingdom come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, thanks for watching, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think.